It was written by Stephen King in 1986 and was influential to all horror novels. You probably already knew this, so I won't waste too much time, but it features a shape-shifting clown named Pennywise who eats children, and our 7 protagonists must kill him. He's in hibernation most of the time, but comes out every 27 years. And the concept is really interesting because he can shapeshift into your biggest fears and he's fueled by the fear of children. Sort of like a horrifying Monsters Inc. In 1990 there was a miniseries adaptation in 2 parts, and in 2017 and 2019 there were 2 movies made, all directly adapting the book. Now I personally haven't read the book, so I don't know exactly how it's structured, but I do know that it features the more iconic parts where they're kids, but then half of the book is them 27 years later. Now in the miniseries, I guess to save time, we were introduced to the characters as adults, and then all the kid scenes are flashbacks. But then in the remakes, the first movie is all the kid scenes, and then the second is all the adult scenes. And spoiler alert, but I vastly prefer how the newer movies are structured. So I have a bit of nostalgia for It 1990. I used to watch clips of it back in the day, and I thought it was really cool. Watching it now, even with rose-tinted glasses, it hasn't aged well. It feels like it's holding back way too much, and feels a little too cheap and low budget, which is just not true. It just seems that way. Before I get into it though, I'll say some things I like. The makeup and practical effects look great. The scene where Pennywise's face is melting away looks incredible. Even though there isn't many practical effects, when they're used they look pretty awesome. And the second part of the series is a lot better actually. We have more time to flesh out the characters now because we're not seeing it in bite-sized flashbacks. The last thing I really liked was the soundtrack. It's not exactly full of bangers. I ain't gonna be jamming out on the bus, headphones in, tapping the rhythm with my fingers, banging my head to it, but it does do a great job at conveying a creepy, empty atmosphere, and fits the tone very well. I think it's really cool how they can play such a clearly upbeat and major tone, but still convey a feeling of ambiguity and dread, and it's just really creative. So the rest of the series isn't very good. My main issue is that it feels like it's holding back way too much, and there's not enough meat on its bones. Especially in the first half. It's not just that they cut away before every kill, which is bad enough, but they also just don't go as far enough as I would have liked with the concepts. I won't get into it too much yet in the future adaptations, but it feels like Pennywise there is truly able to adapt to the kid's biggest fears and actually feels menacing. But here, he doesn't really do much. He just shows up, sometimes becomes a werewolf, and does the whole Tim Curry thing, which to be fair I actually quite like here. It's not exactly as scary as I would have hoped for, but it works. The rest of the acting isn't too amazing, but to be fair, these are kids, and I think the casting is pretty solid. Same goes for the adult scenes as well, but my main issue with the second part was the final battle, which was, well, lame. They beat Pennywise basically in the exact same way as they did before, with silver projectiles. Lame. Give me something new. So yeah, It 1990 has not aged well. It has some solid parts, but it feels like it's underusing its potential. I'd understand if it was PG or had a low budget, but it wasn't. It was rated R in the States originally and had a budget of 12 million. But hey, it's still pretty fun and does a decent job at capturing those good 80s Stephen King vibes. It 2017 is an improvement in almost every way. It's nowhere near perfect, but damn, it's a lot better. So I used to be obsessed with the idea of this movie when it came out. Me being like 11 or 10, I wasn't allowed to watch it, but eventually when I did watch it a few years ago, honestly I didn't think it was very good. I thought the story was dumb, and I guess the novelty had worn off. But then I went back and watched it recently after a few years, and I actually like it a lot more than I did. The story isn't amazing, but it's not terrible. Before, I didn't like how it doesn't really explain much about how the deadlights work or the history of Pennywise, but now honestly I think it works quite well, leaving all that up for interpretation. It kinda gives the vibes of the first season of Stranger Things. Not everything about the Upside Down is explained, but it works perfectly well because it's just up to interpretation. So let's go over why this is a huge upgrade. Well, not only does it capture the vibe of classic 80s kid adventures really well for the time it was made, but it's actually pretty scary comparing it to the 1990 series. In this one, Pennywise feels like an actual threat. The best scene is when he's just trying to freak out Eddie. The performance is so great on both actors. The acting in general is just really great in this movie. The kids do a really good job, way better than the old series. And Bill Skarsgård is just excellent. This movie's style and tone also works very well. It's a lot different to the old one. Here, every single scene just looks gross, in a good way. It's a great way of conveying horror. And it's not just pointless. I'll admit, some of the gore seems a bit like a cheap thrill and doesn't really serve much of a purpose besides shock value, but the other things are really well done. For example, Beverly's house always looks really gross, and this is done to show Beverly's point of view in a domestically abusive household. Every character is great here, but I think Beverly's character has the biggest improvement from the old series. She gets way more to do and she's just the most interesting character, which makes it all the more stupid when they decide to make her a damsel in distress in the climax. Seriously, all this work making a great character for you to do this in the final part? Come on guys. But overall, these characters are developed very well, and this is 100% due to the fact that they have an entire movie to flesh out these characters as kids. This makes us actually care about them more when we see them as adults, but more on that later. So the other things that I'm not a massive fan of include the pacing. Like, do we really need the characters to have a random fight right before the final battle that barely lasts any time, making it so we don't even have time to care about it because we need to focus on the final battle? But at least the final battle itself was pretty cool. The CGI is usually pretty good and actually adds to the horror, which is unusual for CGI, frankly. I'm of the opinion that if you want to scare an audience, practical effects are just the way to go. I get CG is cheaper and it's easier, but I'm not going to get scared of something when it looks like it isn't even in the same room as the fictional characters. But here, the CGI actually looks pretty immersive, most of the time. But it also looks creepy as all hell. The effect of Pennywise opening his big ol' mouth and showing the deadlights and his many rows of teeth looks awesome. However, if this was real life, then this would actually be less dangerous. Excuse me while I talk about physics. You see, pressure is equal to the quotient of force exerted, and the surface area that it's pushed upon. You may have seen those videos of people laying on a bed of nails and being fine, or 10 pins on a balloon. Well, the same would happen to any of Pennywise's victims, which means for him to bite through human flesh, he would have to have one incredibly powerful jaw. But enough for that, time to wrap up. So It 2017 is a huge improvement in every way to the original, but it's not amazing. It's a good time, no doubt, but definitely has some things that bug me. Kind of like the inaccurate physics. I'm just kidding, more so because of the pacing and some of the dialogue which isn't on point. But maybe the next movie might improve on that, just kidding, it blows. It Chapter 2 was released in 2019 and my lord, it's not a fun time. The adult scenes in the original felt like they were connected to the flashbacks, like it's in the same world. Here, all the heart and soul of the 2017 movie is gone. The casting is okay, but like the performance isn't necessarily memorable either. And when I say the casting is okay, I just mean I really like James McAvoy playing Bill because X-Men First Class is a good ass movie, and Bill Hader as Richie is perfect. But overall, it's just boring. Now I do like some of the concepts here, and the horror is still okay, but it's just a total downgrade. It's also way too long, and the pacing has never been worse. And I gotta say, the characters are just boring. They have no personality now. Ben's personality is I used to be fat, now I'm hot. Bev's personality is woman who goes off with Ben in the end. Bill is man with brown hair. Mike at least has something to do, but that doesn't give him a personality. Really, the only ones who slightly resemble their kid self is Richie and Eddie. And it's heavily implied in this movie that Richie is gay for Eddie, which actually makes Eddie's death have way more weight and emotion. And the final battle overall is a very solid improvement from the original. 100% the best scene of the movie. And yeah, that's not saying much, but it is seriously great. But overall, this was a serious disappointment and just loses all of the charm of the original. And I honestly don't have a lot to say about this movie. Frankly, not a lot happens. I know I barely talked about this movie, but I frankly have nothing else to say. It's just very disappointing. So yeah, that was the It franchise. And while I did have a lot of fun with this franchise, I think it's time to let it go. I wouldn't be surprised if at some point they do like a separate series that isn't based off the book, kind of like what they're doing with Chucky 2021, and maybe that would be good, I don't know. Maybe get a new set of characters, maybe we could get cameos of them when they're ancient, who knows. Or heck, maybe we could get cameos from the original casting in 1990. But overall, I do think it's time to let this series go. We don't want it to overstay its welcome, and with that, goodbye.